It's time to get started, so take a seat. It's the Science Café, brought to you by OEB.
Good evening and welcome to the OEB Science Café, the last cafe of the spring semester. We have an exciting topic for you, all about why soils are super. And afterwards, we hope you stick around. We have a very special end of semester reception called Science After Dark. We're going to have food, some delicious desserts, drinks, activities to get you mingling. We'll have a number of the guests from some of the previous cafes over the past school year that you'll have a chance to talk to, so we hope you stick around. Couple of quick announcements before we get started. We want to thank a few of our funding sources. So the Organisms and Evolutionary Biology program is a graduate program at UMass Amherst. The UMass Graduate Students Senate, the UMass Graduate School, and the National Science Foundation all contribute and help make the pizza and all of this possible for you. Quick announcement that video and photos will be taken. So if you don't want to appear in those, let our camera people know. And there will be a little sign-out sheet on a clipboard that's going to get passed around. We'd love you to fill that out. Especially, even if you filled it out before, we have a new column to see if there's interest in summer events that we're thinking about planning. So definitely let us know of your interest level in that. So without further ado, I'm going to let our panel to introduce themselves. So we have a group of 3 different soil scientists from different graduate programs that all are going to provide a unique perspective on soils. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
So, go ahead. Hi, my name is Mariela. I'm a second-year graduate student in the Environmental Conservation Department, and I study soil biogeochemistry.
Okay, I'm Marie Kroger, and I am in the Department of Microbiology. I'm a 4th year, and my focus, I guess, is on soil microbiology.
My name is Lauren Alteo. I am also a 4th year in the Organisms and Evolutionary Biology program and part of Science Café, and I'm also studying soil microbiology.
So we've got 3 different graduate programs represented. The first question I'd like to ask you, and this will give you a chance to show us a little teaser of your study system, and the question is, why is soil important?
Okay. So for me, in the way that I study soils, the reasons why soils are important is because they hold a lot of carbon, and we still don't know how carbon and other nutrients in the soil completely cycle through. And for me, what's really interesting is trying to understand why is it certain things hold on in carbon? Why is it that certain things are being held on in the soil, and why is it that certain things are being released in the soil?
Okay. All right. So I work at the Harvard Forest long-term warming experiments. So my research is centered around looking at simulated warming and the effects of warming on microbial communities. And I first became interested in soil because it's so much more than just this dirt stuff that we think about. It's this living, breathing matrix filled with a diverse array of organisms. So I'm really interested in figuring out who those organisms are, what they're doing, and how they're affected by climate change.
So my work focuses on the Amazon rainforest, and there's a large amount of deforestation occurring in the Amazon, which affects our soil systems. So for me, the reason soil is important is because it's this large storage of carbon that when humans have some sort of impact on it, we then release that carbon into the atmosphere, leading to climate change. So that's where my work starts to come in.
Nice, and so we have study sites from all over the world, California, right here in Massachusetts, Brazil, so we have some interesting perspectives. And all right, so my next question for you is, we all have heard about soil, I walk over soil all the time, but what exactly is it? Can you define soil for us and tell us a little bit more about how it forms?
Yeah, sure. If not to get too into the nitty-gritties, but there's just 5 really big important things that come into play whenever you're talking about soils forming. So there's parent material, which is whatever geological rock makeup the earth is made out of. So like parent material here is very different from parent material in California. And the topography, so how hilly something is, how sloped something is, plays a huge part in how the soil is going to form. The other thing that's huge is climate, organisms, and time. So organisms, you two know a little bit more about, and time, just because it takes maybe years and years for soil to be made. There's a famous quote from Darwin that it takes like about, what was it, like 1,000 or something years, 100,000 years to make like 1 inch of soil. So all of those things kind of play a part into like making soil.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about those organisms? So I know both of you know quite a bit about that. So there's a really surprising number of living things that are in amongst the little bits of rocks and various things in there. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So my focus, like I said, is on microorganisms. So most of what I know is about microorganisms, which control most of the biogeochemical cycles in our soil. So these are the organisms that are responsible for the types of carbon substrates in the soil, the nitrogen cycling, the sulfur cycling, basically any element, they are involved in that processing. And we know that, well, I guess we're getting to that later. I won't go into diversity yet.
Yeah, so I work a lot on diversity of organisms in soil. So Marie basically works on bacteria, right? And the majority of what I do is also bacteria, but there's a whole array of organisms in the soil, including fungi, insects. Now we found giant viruses in the soil. That's a little alarming. We were surprised by that. And so this whole diversity of organisms are breaking down substrates and cycling nutrients, and they're important for soil formation. And so thinking about soil is this like holistic system that involves chemistry and physics and biology. It's what really makes it super amazing and interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about soil as a living, almost breathing thing. And like when we breathe out carbon dioxide. A similar thing is happening in the soil, right? And that's part of what you're trying to figure out is what's controlling how much carbon dioxide is getting, quote unquote, breathed out of the soil. So let's take a look at some of the different diversity of types of soil. And we wanted to point out that back there by that window, we have 2 samples of soil. So Mariella, you want to say a little bit about the 2 types we have and how they fit into our different diversity of soils?
Yeah, sure. So the 2 soils back there, just so that you know, are local. So one is a wetland soil, and the other is more of what would be classified as agricultural soil, or what would be used for agriculture. So what you're looking on the slide over here, that's the 12 soil orders. So soil scientists have already classified soils throughout the world into 12 different, just say, orders. And what this tells scientists is that this is what we can expect from these soils. These are the nutrients we can expect already on here. These are the minerals. This is the parent material they're made of. And that gives them a bit of an idea of what these soils can be used for or not used for. Some soils, like oxasols, that are really red throughout the whole depth, those soils tend to be found in places like where you're studying. So in Brazil, or in like very hot, humid climates. And then soils like inceptisols, which are a lot darker, it'll be hard to see there, but it's like that really dark profile. Those soils tend to be more like up here in the north, where we have more of a cold climate, but because of the geology, they're a lot newer. They're like fresher, babier soils. So that's what we would have back there. The Paxton soil, which is what is the agricultural soil, the one that's more like, if you look at it back there, it's like a lot more fun to play with because it's like softer. It's a lot nicer to hold. That soil is an inceptisol and is very commonly used here for orchards. and agriculture.
Either of you want to add to the diversity of maybe something about the soil at the study sites where you work at and where they fit into this
Sure.
range of soils?
Yeah, so like Mariella was saying, since I work in Brazil, it's a very different soil type than we see here. And yeah, I didn't have any good pictures of the soil because there's all these plants blocking me. But on the left, you can see this is a pasture site, and then we have a primary rainforest. So this is a rainforest that we believe to be untouched by humans, and a secondary rainforest, which is when the pasture has been abandoned and a rainforest comes back. And we see such different soil types based on basically the amount of human interaction with that soil. So a primary rainforest site, we would see fluffy, high organic matter, nutrient matter there, leaf litter. And in the pasture, we get this compaction from cows, and it becomes really tough and clayey and very red. And secondary rainforest is basically a mix of the two. And the one that's there is actually about 50 years old, and it still has a lot of, I guess, physical features of a pasture. So it hasn't completely recovered.
So I work at one single site in Massachusetts, and so we're working with these newer baby soils. But I don't get to see a lot of variation in the type or structure of the soil. But when we look at, we'll go into this a little bit more later, but we're comparing heated and non-heated soil. When we look at the profile of this soil, the heated soil has far less organic material than the control soil. So some of that fluffy organic material is getting eaten up really quickly by some of the soil organisms, and we think that that's being respired as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So.
Anyone ever been to the Harvard Forest? It's probably only 30 minutes from here, so it's open to the public, right? So you can walk right up to these sites, and that photo on the left, the dark square in the middle, is the heated soil, and the white stuff around it is snow. So there are wires underneath the soil that keep it warm. So even in the wintertime, when there's snow everywhere else, that soil is warm enough to melt the snow. So.
And one cool thing about the Harvard Forest is they have an extensive land history documentation. So you can take a look at the Fisher Museum, which there are all these dioramas. You can go take a look at the forestry history, how the land was used and managed. And that plays a big role in the soil as well.
Great, so let's open up to questions at this point. So you heard a little bit about the different study sites that our guests work at and some of the diversity of soil. So what questions do you have at this point? Yeah?
Yeah, one of the speakers mentioned that they were surprised to find big viruses in the soil. Explain why surprised?
Yeah, so these giant viruses have been found, they were first found in aquatic environments mainly, and most of the research that we do is based on DNA sequencing, and so when we do DNA sequencing, we lose some resolution of the types of organisms that are in the soil, and because these things are so small and don't have a lot of DNA, we've been missing them for a while. But I've applied this new method in my research that we were able to concentrate them down and basically isolate their DNA sequences out from all the background information. And they're interesting because they actually live inside other organisms. So there's these single-celled eukaryotic organisms, and it was just surprising to find life inside life within this complex soil ecosystem. Even more complicated than we anticipated it.
Yeah, and another cool thing about these giant viruses and why they're called the giant viruses is you might have this basic picture from intro bio of your own cells are pretty small, bacteria are quite a bit smaller than that, and viruses are way smaller than that. But these giant viruses that you're finding are bigger than some bacterial cells. So it blurs the line between what exactly is a virus or a bacteria and where that in the evolution of these single-celled things, where the viruses fit. It's not as clear a picture as the introductory textbooks might make it seem. So there's really interesting stuff, and that was just discovered in Massachusetts. So you don't even have to go to the rainforest of Brazil to find crazy stuff like that.
But they're probably
I'm working
there.
on the viruses.
Yeah, they're probably there too. So we just gotta look. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm still not entirely sure what soil is. Like, if I'm holding, if I like a handful of dirt, like I stick my hand in the ground and pick up some dirt. If you said there's organic matter, and I guess it's like ground up tiny brown rocks, like what am I holding exactly? Besides the earthworm.
Well, you're holding a community, but so within that soil that you're holding on there, so just like you said, there's rocks. So think about very like plates, tectonic plates that are coming up from the earth. When those things weather, when that material starts to like form into tiny little pieces, that's essentially what you're starting to hold in your hand. You have very weathered rock, sure. It's formed into different kinds of minerals. I like to call, so minerals kind of refers to these like special, so have you guys seen quartz minerals or like diamonds and stuff like that? So those things, but not as precious, not as highly valued, but different forms of those in that clump that you're holding. That's what you have. So something that always makes me think it's very precious, but it probably isn't, is this shiny thing called mica. So there's sometimes a lot of mica in soils that we hold around here, and that's really shiny, tiny little specks. You might see sometimes if you hold your soil and they might have these tiny, shiny specks. But soil also holds organic matter, which goes through its own little weathering process. I'm calling it weathering, but it's decomposition. So it's like basically like you're starting out with like, say dead leaves, like litter, and you're starting out with like organisms that have died. When those things decompose, they form different kinds of compounds. And those compounds go down through a whole process of decomposition that leads to like completely new compounds again and again and again. So you're basically holding a bunch of material in your hand that's like decomposing at different stages already. And along with that, you have live things. So like that worm and any bacteria and viruses, which we never know if they're alive or dead. Or I don't know what I could call them.
I think that's a good point that like there's no one definition of what a soil is. Like it's based on what the parent material is, defined maybe by the organisms that are there. So it's really complicated. And you're right to say that you're holding an entire community in your hand when you pick up that wad of soil.
Yeah, and a lot of these things are stuck to each other. You have a little tiny little bit of a rock stuck to a little bit of a piece of wood, stuck to a little bacterium, so it's a complicated place. Yeah?
Could you comment a little bit on the use of biochar mixed with rock dusts and microbes as a means for improving soil life or restoring depleted soils?
So they use biochar, terra preta, is what it's called in Brazil. And we are doing some research into how that affects at least methane cycling. And so the idea being that basically you're adding this, organic matter that's been pyrolyzed. And so preliminarily, I can say that it's decreasing the amount of methane being released in the atmosphere. The exact mechanism of that, we don't know.
No, I think you're right. I know you're right. You're right. You're right. I have nothing else to add to that, because it's complicated. Because
I think it's hard to create that. Like so, in Brazil, this terra preta is basically created by the indigenous people, and people trying to recreate that has been a struggle to recreate kind of what they did without releasing tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I think there's a lot of research going on in that area.
When you said releasing a lot of CO2 in the creation of the biochar.
Creation, yeah. Yeah.
So we're producing biochar and we're adding basaltic paramagnetic rock dust as well as granite dust and endomycorrhizae. And it's all done locally, and we're using sealed pyrolysis systems,
Okay.
so we're not, and any gases are being combusted for the use of the system, and the oils are condensed to displace fossil oils. But we're really interested in producing the best product we possibly can. And I'm just wondering whether you have thoughts on what you would do if you could influence that.
I don't have any, I'm sorry, I don't have any advice for how to make that better. But I've heard of all different kinds of pyrolyzed forms. I don't know if to call them biochars, but they're all different kinds of pyrolyzed carbons. And just recently, I know some professor from Brazil who was presenting at a conference I went to. He was talking about how they were using pyrolyzed bone material to be able to enhance and hold on to carbon in certain minerals, or better said, metals in soils. So I know that they have multiple uses besides just holding on to carbon and maybe holding on to moisture for an agricultural site. They can also be something that people look at for remediating a site.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
And that kind of flows nicely into the next topic we wanted to talk a little bit more about, and that's, so all right, I understand soil is important, and I want to have a nice healthy soil. So what exactly does a healthy soil look like, if that's even a useful concept?
I think it's really tricky when we start trying to say that this soil is healthy, or trying to classify soils as healthy. So I'm definitely not an agricultural soil worker. I don't work with a lot of agricultural soils, but I know that at least in the field, in the sites that I work, when we talk about a healthy soil, what does healthy mean? What are you using that soil for? Maybe some soil that's used for agriculture isn't great for you to build your building that's supposed to withstand earthquakes. Or maybe the soils that you're using for holding water in a neighborhood are really bad for holding that water, but they're really good for something else. It just really comes down to what you're using them for, whether they're properly used soils, because healthy just gets a little hard to understand what you're trying to apply it for. It's kind of like when we have amongst people, maybe someone has asthma, they're still a healthy person. They have something that maybe doesn't make them that fit for a certain activity or a certain thing that they would want to do, but they're still a healthy person.
Yeah, and that's a great point to think about what we want the soil to do for us. So holding up a building is different than providing the nutrients needed for our crops to grow. So there's a lot of different jobs that the soil can do for us.
Yeah, I think a balance. So I agree with what Marielle is saying, but I think a balance needs to be found with regards to what soil is doing for us, and then what's it going to do for us long term. So, for example, in my study sites, the farmers are perfectly happy with the way their grasses are growing and their cows are eating and whatnot, but we know that they're releasing these massive amounts of methane and carbon dioxide in this process, and we're losing these whole functional groups of microorganisms in this process. So they're happy with it. I'm not exactly happy with it, and I would like to improve it. I understand. I mean, we always have to balance this. There's an economic drive, right? We need food. We need, space for people to live. But we also need to make sure we can continue living here and not have to go to Mars.
It's not the answer.
Almost every soil scientist will probably tell you that.
Yeah. So I'm going to come from the soil biodiversity angle. So I would say that a biodiverse soil is a healthy soil. And kind of playing off what Marie said, we're losing whole functional groups in the soil. We're losing a part of a nutrient cycle potentially. So we are trying right now, there's a whole community of scientists trying to figure out what these organisms are and what their roles are in the soil ecosystem. So understanding the food webs, understanding nutrient cycles, and why each of these organisms might be important in these processes. It's a really huge undertaking, but it's going to be really important for understanding our soil and soil health and what that even means for the future. Something to say.
Just a little add-on, just like, because how we talked about there being different soil orders and different kinds of materials that the soils are made of depending on the parent material. So as things weather, as things change through time, things are useful for some stuff, and things, I should say, some soils become useful for some things, and sometimes through time those soils might not be useful for those things again, just like you guys were referencing to. So a lot of the work that I do kind of looks at how weathered soil minerals are depending on like the root system that's growing there. And that has shown us a lot about how throughout the period of weathering there might be a production of a certain mineral that's great for holding carbon, but it won't be there it won't be there after a certain extent of weathering. So then it's not able to do that anymore. It's not, per se, its potential for holding onto carbon isn't there anymore.
And well, maybe one more before I open it up for a few more questions. But we've talked a little bit about various things that, if you're a plant, let's say you want certain nutrients to help you grow, and the soil has an important role in holding on to some of these nutrients. So can you talk a little bit more about how these nutrients get stored and kept in the soils?
Or do you want me?
I think
That's
it's
fine.
you.
You got so excited at that point. I was like, oh, I have something to say. So just could you retell me the question one more time?
Yeah, how does the soil hold on to the nutrients?
To the nutrients. So, okay, so soils hold on to nutrients. From what I've studied, a lot of it relies on what kinds of minerals are there. And when I talk about minerals, I'm talking about whether a mineral is more silicate based, silica based. So is it a silicate, is it a clay, or is it more of an oxide of some form? Like those red soils we were talking about, the oxasols, they have a bunch of iron oxides. Those are great for holding on to certain nutrient or certain nutrients. Like you wouldn't want your soil to hold on all your phosphate. You want your phosphate, but those iron oxides are great at holding onto phosphate and never letting go. And in that same sense, the clays that are made out of silica, those can hold on to a lot of like potassium, calcium. They can expand, they can change in size, and they're able to allow different kinds of cations. Potassium and calcium being cation substitution. So minerals are really like understanding how they work, how they weather, and how much they've changed throughout the process. Really helps you to know how the nutrients you're applying to a soil might be held onto by those minerals. But that's not the only way that material is held onto, nutrients are held onto within the soil. I know that in organic matter that's in the soil can also possess or have within its own makeup a bunch of other nutrients. So some organic matter might have phosphorus as well and nitrogen, and that might be a nutrient your plant needs. And it becomes like a little battle back and forth for the plant to try to figure out, okay, if I do this, will this be released? Or if I partner up with this microbe, will this help me release this other thing? So it becomes like a little battlefield where they have to deal with different kinds of strategies to try to get different nutrients.
And I've heard that in tropical countries like Brazil, that soils tend to be nutrient poor. Is that the case?
Depends on what soil you're talking about.
So maybe you can expand on that a little bit for us.
Well, sorry, I talk loud as it is. So it depends on what nutrient we're talking about, right? So in the agricultural soil that I study with this monoculture of grass that's actually from Africa, we see a real large increase in organic matter, but not these large structures like lignin and things like that. We see more cellulose, like basically the breakdown of the plant products are kind of kept there. And we see a much higher amount of iron and copper. And that may be due to the increased amount of clay in the soil, kind of keeping it not available. But interesting kind of side note from what you were saying about this whole competition, I think it's a fun fact. The grasses in Brazil that they use, like in 90% of their cattle pastures, are known to stop the nitrification process, basically not allowing ammonia to be converted to nitrate in the nitrogen cycle. And that really affects, obviously, nitrogen cycling, and actually is likely also affecting the methane cycle. So the grasses have evolved to basically, they want the ammonium, so they won't let the microbes have it, and they stop the whole process, which I think is really bad but interesting.
So I have another anecdotal story about how the whole ecosystem kind of plays off each other. So in our warming sites, we were finding, so we have these large 30 by 30 meter plots that we're warming, and we also have a non-warmed plot. And so what we were finding was when we collected leaf litter from trees and we looked at the carbon and nitrogen in these leaves, and phosphorus as well, we were finding that the leaves in the trees from the warmed plots were kind of resorbing some of this phosphorus. And so that might indicate that the warmed plots are losing some of the available phosphorus, so that the trees are then trying to hang on to the phosphorus before they drop their leaves in the fall. So when we're warming the soil, we're changing a lot of things in terms of biodiversity and function and nutrient cycles as well. So it's really complicated.
So do we have any more questions at this point? Yeah, over there.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering around New England, or actually the valley, do you find any detrimental effects from the application of herbicides, pesticides, weed killers, that sort of thing? Doesn't affect soil structure or what have you?
Soil structure.
I have to hear the question one more time. I couldn't really
Do
hear it.
herbicides or pesticides application in the valley affect soil structure or what?
Productivity, I guess.
I'm not aware of it affecting soil structure. I'm not aware of it affecting soil structure, but I mean, I could see how if a herbicide that was meant to target a certain something and actually killed something else, because plants can help with soil structure. So if you apply something that wasn't specific enough and you get rid of a lot of your plants, I could see that changing the soil structure. But besides that, I feel like things like that, like pesticides and herbicides like that, would have more of an impact on like microbes, the community that's already living in that soil. I'm trying to remember, because in my little department, my little lab site, we have people working on like herbicides, we have people working on like metal contaminants, and we have people like me working on carbon and iron. So I'm trying to remember from that what they've told me so far.
I know that copper negatively impacts bacteria in soil. So if you have copper contamination, you might have fewer either helpful or pathogenic microbes.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know specifically to the valley, but I think in general, when you're applying these chemicals that are meant to basically hurt something, there's going to be some effect on the soil diversity, at least from a microorganism standpoint. There's going to be some microbes that have probably evolved to either tolerate it or to utilize it. And then there's going to be a loss of other ones that are not maybe as stress tolerant. But I don't know specifics about the valley.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Since it's the beginning of gardening season, people are probably going to be taking out their rototillers soon. Can you talk a little bit about what that does, and the more recent talk where we're talking about living covers and stuff on land and not tilling, and what the sort of difference is?
Tilling, I can tell you that at least when you look at, it's really funny because when you look at certain soil profiles, and you'll know that there's been a tilling history because of the fact that the size of what that really dark horizon. So if you go back to the slide with the horizons, so soil profiles tend to have a general arrangement of horizons. So like that O horizon being the organic layer, the A horizon, B, and the C. So that dark region where you have a lot of organic matter, in soils that have been tilled, you'll see this definition of like maybe 8 centimeters, 8 inches, or 11, where you can tell that that's where it's that's how deep into the soil it's been tilled, and then the rest of the profile will color-wise look very different, or feature-wise, as in like when you touch it and you try to texture it, it'll look very different. So I don't really work with agricultural soils, but from what I've learned so far from my colleagues, because a lot in my department, we have people working on all different aspects. There's a lot of interesting things. Like some have found that tilling works for some soils. Again, we're coming back to the idea of what makes a soil healthy. For some areas in the United States, tilling can be really helpful to help like move nutrients and mix the soil up. But in some regions, tilling can actually lead to like the loss of carbon and then aeration of the soil and a loss of a lot of that moisture in there. But in some regions, tilling is very important. I actually have a friend who's working on nematodes, and I think they found a new nematode that if you don't till the soil, it will kill all your crops. I think that's more in the Dakotas, though. I don't think we have that problem. So it's just context dependent.
Yeah, and what I've heard about tilling is that it's just one tool in the toolbox of a gardener, and depending on the situation, it might be helpful or harmful, and it may be something that you do one year but not another. So it's just one of the tools you have to keep your soil in the state that you want it in. And I think one of the soils that you brought, you can really clearly see that.
You can see that, like it broke on the way here, and I think that's part of the reason. So the wetland soil in the back, that soil is interesting because it was tilled, that area that it came from was tilled earlier, well, like a couple of years ago. It was tilled and developed for around this recreational site that's used a lot. So you'll see the difference because there's a really compact, rich dark layer where all the grass has been growing into it. But beyond that region, you'll see this very reduced, you'll see this very sticky part of the soil where it's like a greenish bluish color, because that's where the water table has still been able to go up to and still kept all the iron that's usually there reduced. So the color is that greenish grayish color. Yep.
I'm really interested in how soil can store carbon and as a really active part of the carbon cycle. And one thing that I learned that I thought was very interesting, I don't know if you can corroborate this, but that the darkness of the soil, like how black it is very representative of how much carbon it holds.
I feel like that can be. I've heard people talk about that being one of the indicators. Mm-hmm. But so then, are you asking me you asking me how true that is?
Yeah, is there other reasons that soil can be dark, or is it primary?
Well, it could also be, my first thought is also whatever mineral makeup there might be, because those minerals, some minerals, I'm trying to remember right now from the back of my head, there's some that are really dark. Trying to just think, like basalt, some basalts are really dark, but that's more of a rock form. So there's just some parent material that's really dark, so that might play into the fact that you have really dark soils, and that might play into the fact that maybe it's not the organic matter.
I think that's kind of, you could use as a very basic, like general rule of thumb, I suppose. But I do think that the type of organic matter will influence the coloring. Mm-hmm. So like our rainforest soil is really dark a lot of times, and I think that's likely from this higher lignin content.
Is it like general rainforest soil or like the terra preta?
No, just regular rainforest soil. It's very dark.
I would say it's a good indicator, but it's maybe an overgeneralization to say that the color is totally dependent on the carbon content.
And it makes me think of if you've ever looked at a rotting log, and sometimes it looks really brown and crumbly, and other times it looks almost whitish and it's more stringy. So this brown rot.
Fungi,
but that's like part of it is that the white rot, that could be a lot of carbon compounds in there. but it's lighter in color.
Yeah.
And so there's different fungi that can be decomposing different sorts of these organic compounds that come from the sticks and the leaves. So a lot of different factors at play.
Yeah. So, and another thought on that, because every time I get carbon storage questions, I always end up in my head kind of spinning back and thinking, well, carbon storage in like what kind of length of time are we talking about? Like, do you care about holding carbon into your soil for the next 20, 30, 40 years? Or do you care about holding that carbon there for millennia? Because then we start playing with different factors and different things that need to be considered. Because, for example, in a lot of reforestation projects, as I said, reforestation projects that are trying to basically reforest an area, but then in that sense argue that we're adding more carbon to the site. In some cases, that's great for the next maybe 100 years when you have those trees or grasses growing. But whether that carbon input is going to be greater than your carbon output from whatever those plants are respiring, because plants breathe too, like us, and microbes breathe in the soil. So you'll also have carbon coming out from the soil in the end. So whether those inputs of that carbon that you're putting in are going to be greater than those outputs, that then becomes something you really have to consider and think about whether it's actually leading to carbon storage in then the millennia afterwards.
Yeah, so many, since you brought up reforestation, and something I'm personally very interested in. So many of these reforestation projects that you maybe are reading about take into no consideration the soil. They are only telling you that there's this amount of carbon stored because they planted trees and the trees grew and carbon in the trees. It has nothing to do with the soil. Just think about that.
Yeah, that reminds me of my undergrad project.
And so, did we have another question?
Yeah.
Well, to follow up on that line of discussion, many people have become concerned that the trees are not sequestering enough carbon. And there's a lot of talk about how we need to stop tilling, we need to grow diverse things in a more permacultural way so as not to disturb the soil. And the whole goal is an unidentified time horizon of sequestering carbon in the soil, because it's a way of dealing with all of our sense of total impotence in the face of global warming and possible catastrophe. So there are a lot of people interested in that sort of thing, and a lot of people doing things, some of which may be nonsense. And I may be doing some of the nonsense, so it's very important to me, and I think to a lot of people, to get good scientific advice about this project that we're engaged on, which, people who are not dumb are involved in promoting this. It's not like a sort of Reader's Digest sort of thing, but...
Yeah, it's really hard. Like, within the whole community of soil scientists, sometimes I can spend all of my time on my work and never talk to a soil microbiologist. And the same thing goes with soil microbiologists. They could spend their whole time working on their stuff and never think about the soil mineralogy. So we're really trying to start mixing up and talk to each other more and be more interdisciplinary within our fields. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to push through. I mean, I keep thinking about different instances I've been in where I was at a university where I'm like, well, if you're working on this geology mineral project and what you're talking about really sounds like what I just heard from this other soil chemist, why aren't you guys talking to each other and working on this? Sometimes it's we kind of need to remember that we're all working on the same system and we're all in this same earth and working on this together, so we kind of need to try to pull ourselves together and work a lot more with each other.
Yeah, and I think just one more missing piece in there that I hope in the next decade we'll see a lot more interplay is with policymakers. So, my brother actually does environmental policy and reforestation and whatnot, and I was talking to him recently about, these reforestation projects where they're not taking into account the soil and they're not measuring things the way that I would consider to be a good experimental design and things like that. And I think that comes from a lack of just scientific knowledge and talking to the scientific community. And so I think more dialogue between those policymakers is necessary to give you the advice that you want. Because right now, I don't think we have it really.
And I'd say that there's also a lack of understanding of a lot of these things that will inform things like policy. Yeah. There's still a lot of questions out on whether tilling is a good thing or not, and all these different conditions that you need to consider.
And so that flows somewhat nicely into one question that we wanted you each to have a chance to touch on, how your particular research fits into this picture, this very difficult yet important question of how the soils affect climate change. And I know that all three of you work on a different piece of this puzzle, so I'll give you a chance to talk about how your particular research fits into this goal that we have.
Okay, so for my research, I look at soils in California, and those soils, those are really special because they're aged from about 120,000 years to 65,000 years. And at each one of the sites that are differently aged, we're seeing how roots have completely changed the mineral material. So in that slide over there, you can see where that finger's pointing. That gray spot you see going down deep, over a meter in depth, that is where a root was, growing, regrowing, dying, regrowing. And what that's told us so far is how that material around it has changed and how those mineral materials have changed can hold on to carbon, like how much carbon can those mineral materials hold on to. And at each different stage, we're seeing how they've changed and how much carbon they have. So just to get a little bit of a grasp of what that means, what we're trying to understand is how is it that roots change the soil through time, and how does that lead to change in carbon storage, basically carbon of the soil being able to hold on to carbon.
Yeah, so I work on this very large interdisciplinary team that's trying to get a whole picture of the methane cycle and land use change in tropical rainforests. So our work is trying to identify, basically create a model that we can put into the current models, where if you were to know the amount of methane coming out of a soil, you may be able to then predict what microbes are there and vice versa. And this would really help us inform other scientists globally, I would say, about, without having to do the same amount of legwork that we're doing, you could go and maybe possibly just do a 16S sequencing study to identify who's there and say, oh, okay, so this amount of methane is likely to be coming out of this. And if you know the soil type, you would be able to say, okay, well then maybe we should till or not till, or something like that. So we're trying to get a global perspective on the methane cycle in the tropics.
And like I've said a few times now, I work at the Harvard Forest. So we have 3 separate experiments ongoing. So there's one that was started in 1991, one that was started in 2002, and one that was started in 2006. And so we've been warming the soil continuously for those lengths of time. And what we're interested in here is looking at the effects of simulated climate change on things like carbon storage, organismal diversity, organismal function, and just the overall functioning of the ecosystem as a whole. So my angle is mostly from the genomics side, so I'm taking soil samples and sequencing them to figure out which organisms are present in the soil, and discovering some new organisms and figuring out their functions. So we're hypothesizing that some of the carbon content is changing, like the quality of the carbon, with this long-term warming experiment. And so we want to investigate if the community of organisms is shifting in some way to account for this shift in carbon. So a lot of work, lots of groups are also working on this particular experiment. And the goal of this is also to inform these global Earth system models, where we're looking at the feedbacks of microorganisms in the soil to global climate change and carbon dioxide flux.
So maybe one day we could have like a probiotics for the soil, or if you heard about this, you can take something to help your gut. Maybe we'll figure out enough about these communities of microbes living there that we'll know how to help certain ones that might.
They're doing that in agriculture already.
Yeah.
You could see it happening.
All right, we have time for maybe one or two more audience questions before we wrap it up. So, yeah.
One thing hasn't been talked about is plant exudates and the plants, their relation with their exudates feeding the organisms and stuff in the soil.
So that's interesting because that's part of a second project that I'm working on, because a lot of what we're learning on my current project that's looking at how roots have affected the mineral material, we're realizing that a lot of exudates don't do the same things to the same minerals, and the same can be said about like the microbes. Like not all exudates interact with microbes in the same way. So plants release a lot of really active compounds that are carbon too. So they release glucose, which is a sugar that would be more like a food for a microbe. But they can also release organic acids, and these organic acids can actually destabilize or dissolve some of the mineral material in the soil, releasing some carbon. So it's really funny how like complex a root becomes once I start to learn about all the things it releases and how active it is, and how at different stages of root development, different kinds of exudates will be released. So some of these organic acids are meant to specifically pick for, like, say, dissolving a certain kind of iron mineral. Or some exudates, like siderophores and like chelators, are meant to like kind of like do the same thing, or go out and get a specific kind of nutrient that the plant really needs and bring it back. So there's a lot going on there, and these exudates, we're still trying to completely understand like what's their potential, what kind of reaction mechanisms can they lead to in the soil, and what does that mean for the carbon that's there.
That's a new word for me. Can you define exudate?
Yeah, so exudate is basically anything that the plant is releasing.
Okay, so sort of like an extrusion.
Yeah. Like it exudes it out, yeah. So it like
People use
releases
the
it out.
term leaky roots.
Leaky,
They're like
yeah.
leaking out nutrients
Okay.
into the environment.
Good.
It
Yeah.
can be a very high percentage of the plant's energy is actually put out through its exudates.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for maybe one more audience question. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the soil that comes from composting and how that relates to different fertilizers or the natural soil and its carbon content?
So what I can tell you about one thing that's different about composting than soils that are like, for example, here in New England, is that worms are great for that, but worms are not great for these soils. So unless you want to do agriculture, then that's a different thing. But so for compost is really interesting because it's like you're basically making all these, you're making, I want to say making, but you're really just preparing all these nutrients in a way that makes them accessible for plants and whatever it is that you want to grow. And what's really interesting about compost is that I feel like a lot of the ratios in which you have nutrients in there, and a lot of the way in which like microbes are all working in there is like my biofuel in super sense. Like I have the extreme material here ready to like keep moisture, keep nutrients, have organisms here that are all going to work together that are going to help me keep my crops going. So I think it's really cool. I think it's really fun. I've had classes where we try to make our own compost and see how many people have more worms than the others, and see if we can win the competition by worm mass. So it's really interesting, and it's really fun when you get into it. And I think it's really useful for some of the stuff that we've seen, like agricultural in your backyard, like you want to make your own little garden and stuff.
I don't know much about compost.
And then, did you want to say
I think
something about
compost is super cool too. It's a really diverse bunch of interactions between different microbes and nutrients and earthworms. So
yeah.
I don't really have much to say other than that, but it's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's kind of where you can add a lot of life into the soil, huh?
It's like soil superfood. Like we're adding in this nutrient dense pocket of awesomeness to our garden.
All right, so I have one more wrap-up question for each of the panelists to respond to. But before we get to that, want to make sure that you'll stick around for at least a little bit. We have this reception plan. We have an activity to get you mingling that I'm going to explain in a little bit. So after they have a chance to respond to this last question, don't go anywhere. I'll give you a couple announcements about what's going to be happening. So we hope you all stick around. There's food and drink for you to enjoy. But before we get to that, the final question I have for you each is, looking forward, what are you most curious and or excited about with soils research?
So I'm most excited about some of the things we talked about here in terms of this being a really interdisciplinary, huge problem that lots of different people are tackling. So talking to people across soil chemistry, soil physics, and trying to get a better understanding of what soil is and how to keep it healthy and how to use it to benefit us and to benefit the planet. That's what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, I think some of what I'm most excited about has been touched on as well, which is I really want to focus on the translational science, being able to do science that can be given to a policymaker so that we can inform the public and try to not be so, I don't know, hidden and scary and not understood, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. I'm excited for all of those things. And I think for me, the thing I'm most excited in terms of research going forward is just trying to understand how it is that these minerals, again, like they can change, they can predetermine what's going to come out of the soil. So some soils have like chromium in them, so it's natural for them to release chromium if they've gone through certain oxidation or reduction cycles. And for some soils, it's like the materials that they have just make them more predisposed to holding carbon than others. So that stuff is really cool to me, and I feel like if we knew a little bit more about how this stuff works, we can better inform people who are going to use the soil or develop the soil, or a community that's going to try to live within around the area of that soil, so that we don't have problems that I've heard of so many places where they're like, oh, well, now I have arsenic here, or now I have this problem here because we didn't know about this soil, or now my home is sinking into the ground because Florida's got issues right now. So, like, if we knew these things about the soils, then these kinds of problems would be hopefully avoided in the future. And I feel like if we have people working on that, that'd be great. That'd be great, and I really want to be part of that powerhouse.
All right. Well, I have a couple of things to say before you get up, but let's give them a quick round of applause. And so one thing that we'd love for you to do here is have a chance to talk to our panelists from tonight. And I know we have a couple of guests who were previous speakers at Science Café. I see Roger back there, who can tell you all about the Puritan tiger beetles that are locally endangered. I think I saw Dara, is she here? Yeah, and she spoke to us earlier about marine mammal mating strategies. Did any of our other past speakers show up yet? I think a few others may be showing up soon, so look around for them. We put together a little activity to get you moving around talking to people, so I have these sheets up here, and basically, there's a couple of blanks where you need to find somebody in the room. They have to be all different people, and ask them whatever the question is here. And I have a number of pens and pencils for you to write this down. We want you to get around talking to people that you might not know yet, and encourage the people that aren't all UMass grad students to stick around and talk to some of us. So to encourage you to complete this, if you can bring to me a completed one of these, you will get a very special limited edition OEB Science Café sticker. Only will be given to completed activities. So we hope you stick around to take care of that. And we also have delicious food, cupcakes made by Maggie, who's basically a professional baker. These are real good cupcakes. We have drinks, and we also have, in keeping with the soils theme, the edible dirt cups, complete with sprinkles to represent the microbes, right?
Some earthworms.
Earthworms, the gummy worm earthworms in there. So yeah, bear with us. And the last thing is, you might see some photos around on the walls, some pieces of art that were done by UMass graduate students, many from our program. So take a look at those. So bear with us as we get the chairs out of the way and set up some of this food. So let's give one more round of applause to our guests.